Good evening. On behalf of the Cuba program of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, as well as the Center on Global Energy Policy, also of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, we welcome you tonight to the webinar, Cuba's Energy Challenges. Excuse me. As you know, blackouts, brownouts, and scarcity of oil, gas, and gasoline have seriously affected Cuba in recent years. In addition, in August 2022, a fire raged through, boy, excuse me tonight. A fire raged through Matanzas, destroying oil reserves and gasoline reserves. Tonight we're having two outstanding speakers. Jorge, I'm going to have to. Jorge Piñon, who's a senior research fellow at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, and Ricardo Torres, who is a research fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University and previously received his doctorate from the University of Havana, where he taught for 15 years in the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy. I would give a longer bio for both of them, but as you can see, my asthma is kicking up. So I'm simply going to turn it over to Jorge Piñon, who's going to talk about, is there a short-term solution to Cuba's electric power sector challenge or longer-term one? And Ricardo Torres is going to speak in terms of contextual issues relating to the Cuban economy and its impact on the energy sector. So we will start with Jorge, whom I've mentioned is at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin as a senior research fellow, and who prior to that had been at Brookings and spent 32 years in the energy sector in the Americas and in Europe. Our first speaker will be Jorge Piñon from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you, Margaret, for your kind introduction, and also to the center for their kind invitation. Thank you, Ricardo, for joining me as a co-presenter, and also to the technical staff, which also always makes these kind of events happen. What I would like to do, and I hope, please let the organizers know if you can see the slide that I currently have. Let me see if I can erase myself from here. So what I wanted to do is take about 10 or 15 minutes and again, share with you Cuba's situation today, and where we are. And again, later on, we'll have a conversation with Ricardo about whether there are any short-term solutions or whether this is much of a longer-term challenge that Cuba has. The baseline data that I'm using today is that data that we find in La Oficina Nacional de Estadísticas de Cuba, for 2021. So that's my baseline data. Cuba today has about 6,700 megawatts of installed rated capacity. This is the capacity that is guaranteed by the manufacturers of the generating units. Of that, 39%, about 2,600 megawatts, is oil fire baseload thermoelectric power plants. There's 8 of them, and then there are 20 generating blocks within those 8 thermoelectric power plants. The challenge here is that most of these blocks are close to 40 years old. They have had some scheduled maintenance, but they have had very little capital maintenance, if any. Also remember that they all burn high sulfur Cuban crude oil, which is very heavy, sulfur content of between 3.5 to 5% sulfur. So this accelerates the corrosion of the units, and that's a big challenge for UNE, which is Cuba's electric monopoly. Today, the most recent report from UNE is that 9 out of the 20 blocks are out of service. So close to 50% of them are out of service today, either because of capital maintenance or because of scheduled maintenance. 16 of the blocks are past their capital maintenance schedule. So this gives you an idea that you have a system, again, a base load thermoelectric oil fire system that is going downhill. There are constant repairs to the system. In fact, this morning's UNE report shows, again, as I mentioned earlier, that 45% of the blocks are out of service. They also have about 39% in oil-fired distributed generation. This distributed generation came in 2004 as part of the Revolución Energética, which in turn, it was again a short-term solution to the problems that the Guiteras plant, which is the one in Matanzas, was having at the time. Those of you remember that this is when Marcos Portal, who was the energy minister at the time, was fired. Yadira Garcia replaced him. And then the Cuban government enacted their Revolución Energética, which was to bring Cuba out of the blackouts and brownouts that were going on in 2004 and 2005. But again, this 39% of distributed generation is oil fire, high sulfur fuel oil, and diesel, which, as we all know, is in short supply. About 9% of generation is natural gas, associated natural gas, in a joint venture with Sherritt, which is called Energas. They recovered the associated natural gas from crude oil production, and they run a number of combined cycle plants. There's about 3 of them. Their capacity is about 580 megawatts. But lately, natural gas production has been declining. So that also has been going down. You have then renewables, basically solar, wind, and hydro, which has about 5% of generation. You have biomass, basically sugarcane biomass. And this is a figure that is always difficult for us to chase down and get a clear figure between that published by Cuba and that published by ONE. And then finally, in the last year or so, Cuba has brought in some floating power plants. Again, they burn high sulfur fuel oil from Turkey. There were originally 3 of them, which were stationed in Mariel. And now they added another 3 floating power plants, which are stationed in Havana Harbor. They're producing probably about 400 megawatts. In fact, the last two came on stream earlier this week. But again, this is a Band-Aid solution, temporary solution. It is not a long-term solution. The picture in renewables, it's good only in solar. They have a huge increase of about 230% of solar from 2017 to 2021. But that is not the case in wind. They have a project in La Herradura, which has not been able to get off the ground during the last 6 years. They have a brand new biomass facility that they built adjacent to the Cerro Redondo sugar mill, which again was tested, is running, was connected to the grid, but it's not operating. It's not operating because there's no sugarcane. So even though their goals recently announced for 2030 is for 37% of renewables by 2030, that's really a pipe dream. That is no way that it can be achievable from the current status in 8 years. There's no capital, there's no money. So I think renewables is not going to get off the ground. And of course, they continue to run high sulfur crude oil and high sulfur fuel oil in the current thermoelectric power plants. And that doesn't help either in the performance of those plants. So really, in a nutshell, you have a system that's broken. You have a system that's tired. You have a system that's old. And there's only a short-term solution. I mean, a long-term solution, sorry. Short-term solution, they don't have the two critical issues that they have. One, they don't have time, and they don't have money. We believe, for example, that the total recapitalization of the thermoelectric power plants is going to cost about $5 billion. Cuba doesn't have the money, and the credit lines, I believe, are not there. Add to that another $4 to $5 billion in order for them to achieve the 37% of renewable power that they will need. So again, short-term solution, regrettably, we just don't see it. Lack of time, lack of capital. Long-term solution is the total recapitalization of the system. They have to stop the Band-Aid strategy. They tried the Band-Aids in 2004 with the Grupos Electrógenos, and they're trying Band-Aids again with the floating power plants. But I just don't see another outlet for them. Again, there's no capital, there's no money. So I'll stop here. This is just a summary of where they are. Ricardo will pick up the discussion, and then hopefully after Ricardo finishes, we can have a conversation. You folks can join us. Please let us know what your questions are. We're here for you, and we look forward to a conversation. Ricardo?
Yes. Well, I have to, as customary in this case is, so I'd like to thank Columbia University, the Institute of Latin American Studies, Mike Graham personally, whom I've known for already a long time, as it is the case with Jorge Piñon. It's also a great pleasure for me to share this venue with Jorge, because we've been in touch in the last few weeks as we started preparing this event, and it is incredible how much we learn from Jorge, right? He brings industry expertise, so it's not like the typical academic where it's read tons of books and then talks about that. No, he's lived that, so it's that's always a bonus for someone like myself. So yeah, so I also want to share a few slides, 5 of them actually, and then, like I'll start making my points through the presentation. Hopefully, before we take a question from the public, we can start a conversation among ourselves. Because, connected to the situation that we are seeing in Cuba today, it's also the fact that, the blackouts, and we've seen, for instance, in the last few days that apparently energy demand has come down. So we are also wondering ourselves, what's the main reason behind that? Because of course, a way to deal with shortage of output is if you reduce demand, then you can bridge a gap between supply and demand. But we hopefully will have a conversation about that before we can take the public questions. Anyway, so I'll start sharing my presentation. So I think you can see it now. Jorge talked about this, but I want to, I like to make a few points about what's happened in Cuba in the last 8 years or so around renewable energy. It's still quite fresh in my memory when in 2014, the Cuban government launched this program to significantly increase their share of renewable sources in Cuba's electrical mix. At that time, I recall that some people discussed, 24% in 2030. It doesn't sound like a lot. So I still recall folks that were, telling me, well, Cuba should be more ambitious when it comes to the energy transition. The whole world is embracing a greener future. So 24%, a quarter of electricity production is not very ambitious. It doesn't sound like a lot. Well, 8 years after that program was launched, what we can see is that some progress has been made, but certainly not enough to introduce a significant change in Cuba's energy mix. So you can see here that really from the 3 sources, I'm not including biomass here because there are some issues with data there. And most of Cuba's biomass actually comes from, as we know, the sugarcane industry. What's really changed is that the installed capacity in solar, photovoltaic, solar has increased significantly in the last 5 years. That's where we see the big change in terms of the contribution of renewable energy. And well, so hydro is essentially flat. Cuba, it's not known for having lots of resources in that area anyway, but it was definitely part of that plan that was launched in 2014. So they were aiming at increasing that, installed capacity in hydro as well. But of course, we had to make the investment, and that entails having the resources for it. And then wind, I recall also that when the energy revolution was launched in 2004, 2005, there were big hopes around wind energy. So research was conducted, and again, there were big aspirations when it came to its contribution. Reality is that it's very costly. It needs a lot of money, and also you need like deep engineering capacity to make it happen. That's also important because very often, the conversation that we hear about, when it comes to Cuba, but specifically when we debate Cuba's energy challenges, is that the biggest problem is that we don't have enough money, right? But in some cases also it entails engineering capacity and construction capacity that Cuba obviously doesn't have as of now, and that's been a problem for some of the projects that were started in the last decade. So essentially, wind has stayed flat, and again, the big change has come from solar energy. Cuba is a tropical country, so one would imagine that if Cuba is to successfully address its energy problem, solar will be a big part of that solution in the future. But as it is true for other sources, it also needs money. That it needs capital, and it needs time to deploy the facilities. I think Jorge shared something like this in his presentation, but I just want to highlight here one thing. Despite all the discussion and all the talk about renewable energy, the program the Cuban government launched in 2014, reality is that in terms of the contribution to electricity output, the share of renewables has not increased in the last 8 years. So I recall that at that time, the number that we were managing in terms of the share of renewable in Cuba's total electricity production was 5%. Something around 5% of total electricity came from renewable. Well, if you look at this graph from, those numbers are from 2020, the situation is more or less the same. And within that, biomass, most of it coming, as I said, from sugarcane, it's the biggest contribution within renewable energy. Now, as we will see later on, big challenge here is that also one would imagine that Cuba can produce or could produce a significant amount of energy out of its sugarcane industry, right? So it's long been part of that strategy in Cuba. But the big problem is that we don't have a lot of sugarcane anymore. And without the sugarcane, we would not be able to meet those goals either. So that's something that goes beyond the energy system, and that's something that I actually will address in the final part of my initial presentation. This is another hot topic these days, as the crisis unfolded, in 2020, 2021, there's been a big discussion in the country about, how to, what's been happening in terms of the resources that Cuba do have. And this is one of the main points of this part of the presentation. So certainly Cuba faces big challenges, in terms of its economic model, its economic viability. But the point that I want to make here is not about, whether Cuba is investing enough overall, because the answer to that is no. Cuba hasn't been investing enough in the last 30 years. Investment as a share of as a percentage of GDP, depending on the number that we use, has been hovering around 10 to 15% a year. A country, if we look at East Asia, if we look at China, just to give you some context, that number is well above 30%. So Cuba hasn't been investing enough. But again, the point here is, of the resources that Cuba do have, how are we using them? Having in mind that the energy infrastructure is a key part of any of a country's economy. And so I just wanted to compare here 3 destinations of that investment since 2010. So we have, all the resources that have gone through to goods. Goods here is essentially manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. By the way, that includes all the investment that the joint venture with the Canadian company has carried out in nickel mining and nickel production in Cuba, which is quite a lot by Cuban standards. Then we have the money that has been invested in hotels. And hotel is a proxy really for most of the resources that have gone to, the hotels and all the facilities around international tourism. And then we have the resources spent on electricity, gas, and water. So we don't really have the number for electricity or energy alone. But if we look at that number, we see that priority has really been around tourism, international tourism, hotels in the last 12 years or so. It's very clear from the picture. It's almost now half of the total amount of resources spent on investment in Cuba on a yearly basis. And I have to say that during that period, specifically started in 2014, investment in Cuba, total investment has more than doubled. Yes, again, Cuba doesn't have enough resources to invest. That is true. And there are many factors around that. But again, overall investment has more than doubled in less than 10 years, in less than a decade. And of that amount, almost half now goes to hotels and, essentially significant part of the tourism infrastructure. And if we look at electricity, gas, and water, the three sectors, although one may argue that electricity is the majority of that number, it started the period at 14% of total investment and is now only 9%. And well, obviously, if we look at the state of Cuba's electricity infrastructure right now, the conclusion is that obviously that's not enough. That's not enough to keep those plants running in good shape, to keep a reliable electricity production system. So that's something that we definitely have to have in mind. Again, resources are insufficient in terms of investment, true, but also there is a question here about where the priorities are in terms of the allocation of those resources. Of course, the argument goes like, well, tourism, international tourism has a bright future for Cuba. Part of this trend, of course, started under the Obama, in the last years of the Obama administration. It seemed that Cuba didn't have enough rooms and hotels to accommodate the growing number of international visitors, but that changed. That changed clearly in the last 4 years or so. And so probably it is time to, reassess those priorities in the light of, in light of the current situation in the energy infrastructure. So that's something that, again, that we want to keep in mind as we discuss further this issue. Another point that I want to make here is about, when we look at Cuba's numbers, when it comes to the end use of the electricity that is produced, one figure that immediately flashes is that a very high proportion of electricity consumption in Cuba is made by households. And I look at averages in the region, Latin America, Central America, more specifically, the Caribbean, and the numbers were very, a lot smaller than they are in Cuba. And that's something that, it talks about the specificities of a country like Cuba. Of course, there are several reasons for that. I want to comment briefly on four of them, because as we project how can Cuba pay for the needed investments in its energy infrastructure, we have to look at how that electricity is consumed, because that tells us who is going to pay for that, or who's more likely to pay for that. Now, again, as I said, there are, in my opinion, at least 4 reasons that explain that rather high proportion of residential consumption in Cuba's total electricity consumption. One is that until very recently, the whole activity of the private sector in Cuba was included in that number. The private sector, it spans, it works in different activities, different industries, but most of that activity was counted as part of residential consumption because there wasn't really a way to separate that. And even though again it's a production sector, it was included as part of residential. Now they started, separating those two numbers in 2020, but still, what it is accounted for by the private sector is a very small part of overall electricity consumption. So one may want to look at that. The second reason is that also due to the energy revolution in 2005, 2006, there was a big change in the structure of energy use within Cuban households. Because part of the proposal at the time was that households use more electricity especially for cooking purposes. So that increased their participation in total electricity consumption. Then there has been issues with that. Some, part of the appliances that were distributed at the time, people complained that they were not very reliable. Then there's been a lack of spare parts and so on. So that has also created problems and issues for Cuban households. But that's something that is definitely part of the explanation. Then there are two more that, in my opinion, are more important, especially as we want to understand what can be done for the future. One is that if we look at Cuba's income distribution and the dynamic of electricity consumption in the residential sector, and one that, having knowledge about Cuba's informal economy and the fact that many Cuban families depend also on remittances. A third factor is that one can come to the conclusion that in reality, at least for some, Cuban households, their income is not necessarily connected to the dynamics of the domestic economy. In other words, they derive a significant part of their income from activities that are not necessarily reflected in the formal economy. Meaning that perhaps households' disposable income is rising way faster than the overall economy. And part of that reflects on energy consumption. We see that, as a clear development pattern. Income rises, energy consumption goes up as well. So that's something to bear in mind. Why? Because it means that one would not be able to account for that change by looking at the formal, the numbers from the formal economy in Cuba. And second, if the Cuban electric utility like to collect enough revenues to fund investments in the future, it will have to find a different way to get to that income, because that income is not necessarily being reflected in the household formal balance sheet, but eventually that income will end up in the retail sector, or more generally in hotels or in other sectors. So the electric company would not be able to collect that extra income from the households directly because of the way it is created. And then also very important for the current discussion is the fact that in 2016, the Cuban government started introducing energy rationing in the public sector. So at that time, it became evident that supplies from Venezuela were going down. So they started at a strategy aimed at reducing energy in general, electricity, more specifically consumption in the public sector. And the idea was that, of course, Cubans remember very well the days of a special period in the early 90s, and blackouts are not necessarily very popular. So the government wanted to limit the impact, the negative impact of that in the residential sector, meaning that even though the public sector was consuming less electricity, it meant that residential consumption continue rising. So finally, I'd like to show here just an example of a Latin American country that has made a big transformation in the last 15 years or so. It's been quite a big change in Uruguay's energy mix. So you see there that of course the big increase has come from wind, and now the country has a more diversified electric energy mix, and it's even exporting electricity to some of its neighbors, especially Brazil and Argentina. Now, is that relevant for Cuba these days? I want to bring some numbers here just to put the Cuban case in context. Uruguay is a small country, but see three things that we have to keep in mind as we discuss Cuba's prospects for the future. One is, according to the UNDP, Uruguay's gross national income per capita is almost 3 times as high as Cuba's. So that's something very important, because all the investment that will be needed in the future to bring more sustainability to Cuba's electricity production will need to be paid for. And then a poorer country has, of course, less resources to pay for those big investments. So that's one big difference. The second point that I want to make here is that, connected to what I just said, well, electricity is not cheap in Uruguay. It's always been quite expensive, but it has become even more expensive in the last decade or so. Yes, they diversified their electric energy mix. It is a lot more reliable now. They're making some, they are even exporting energy, as I said. But again, someone has to pay for that. And that price is quite high for a country the size of Uruguay, and for the country, even considering Uruguay's rather high GNI per capita in the Latin American context. I mean, the number for the US is 14 cents on average. It depends on, it changes by the state. It's different in every state, but the average is 14 cents. So Uruguay has a third of US GDP per capita and pays a third more in terms of electricity in the residential sector. So it's not cheap. And so the answer to the question that we posed before is that, what in Uruguay, yes, someone is paying for that investment, and that is Uruguayans for the most part. And one may add also the companies that operate in Uruguay, even though they receive like a reduced fare. And then just to put and to connect to the argument that Jorge put forward before, in terms of that commitment that Cuba has just made in terms of the renewables participation in the electric energy mix for 2030, and what it means in terms of resources. Just to achieve this transformation, Uruguay invested more than $7 billion in a decade. $7 billion in a decade. So adding wind capacity, solar, although you see that solar there is still not a big part, biomass, and so on. So it's a big amount of resources. And just quoting a Cuban government official at a fair that was held in Havana in the last few months, they said that Cuba had invested from 2014 to 2021 slightly more than $500 million in renewable energy. Compare that against more than 7 billion for Uruguay, just to make that transformation that Cuba is aspiring to possible. So it only talks about the big challenges ahead. Now, I want to finish by just briefly mentioning some things in terms of connecting the energy situation with the overall reform in Cuba's economy. Again, the numbers that Jorge just mentioned seem well beyond Cuba's possibilities as of now. A country that is sanctioned by the United States, that is not part of any major international development bank. Certainly an amount of resources that is well beyond what Cuba has invested overall in the last 10 years or so. Well, Cuba may also want to consider changes in the way foreign investment is carried out. So there's been a big discussion about foreign investment. The country admits that if it wants to meet those goals, we will need to increase the participation of foreign investment to deliver that. But there are lots of complaints in terms of foreign investors to come to Cuba. They find a not so business-friendly environment and so on. So there is an ongoing discussion about that, but one may want to see an acceleration in those changes as well. Now, the third point is a stagnant economy would not be able to pay for that. Well, the only good thing about a stagnant economy is that one may think that Cuba's energy demand would not grow substantially over the next 8 years or so. Nonetheless, even to keep the current system running, as we saw already, the numbers are impressive. So you need economic growth to deliver that, to be able to afford that. A rather poor country like Cuba, which is currently cash strapped, is having lots of difficulty to meet its international obligations, would not be able to deliver a credible framework for investors and creditors and lenders to provide the resources needed to carry out that transformation. And then lastly, around biomass, because that connects to the overall state of Cuba's sugarcane industry, and more importantly, about agricultural reforms. There's been a lot of back and forth about those, those in the last 14 years or so. Let us all recall that this most recent wave of reforms started in agriculture. But beyond the headlines, reality is that Cuba is producing now a lot less sugarcane than it used to 10 years ago. And again, without sugarcane, there is no biomass, then there is no increased participation of that source in Cuba's energy mix. So I leave it here, and well, I look forward to comments and questions from the audience and Jorge as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Jorge,
Yeah,
Ricardo, why don't you clarify some of the issues that you've both raised that may be slightly different?
yeah.
Jorge?
Let me go over a couple of points that Ricardo put on the table. Number one, clean, reliable, and secure energy is not cheap. Let me repeat that. Clean, reliable, secure energy is not cheap. That's number one. Number two, Cuba has to change its centralized economic model. The issue is structural. And the best case in point is sugarcane. By the way, last year, sugar production was the lowest, not in 10 years, it was the lowest in 100 years. So how can you move forward with a strategy that for 2037 calls over 600 megawatts of biomass when there's no sugarcane? In fact, they even wanted to burn marabu, which is a small tree that grows in areas, in rural areas that there's no agricultural. And even the marabu is not enough to satisfy Cuba's biomass needs. They invested 186 million. This is a joint venture at the Cerro Redondo sugar mill between Cuba and a group of British investors that eventually Shanghai Electric, and no impact here with the embargo, by the way, came in and put in on the table $186 million to build this 60 megawatt plant that is already connected to the grid and is sitting idle. Now, what business you invest in which you do not guarantee the feedstock, the supply of feedstock? Do you think that anyone in Cuba is going to build any biomass facility to generate electricity if there's no sugarcane, if there's no marabu? So take that one off the table. Sugarcane industry has to be again changed. The economy has to change, the economic model, if you really want biomass, or for that matter, any of the other renewable energy sources. So again, to talk about with Ricardo, the centralized economic model has to change. Energy is not cheap. He mentioned something else, which is very true. And in fact, Diaz-Canel mentioned it about a couple of weeks ago. And that is the lack of project management and the lack of execution in Cuba. Case in point, for example, is the Chinese-funded wind project at La Herradura in Las Tunas, which is originally a 50 unit, 100 megawatts, fully funded by China. And today, only 22 of the turbines are going to be operational for 50 megawatt project. Why? Because the geological studies that they did where the foundations for these pillars is going on was too close to the ocean, and they have saltwater intrusion. So there is saltwater intrusion in about 20 of the units of this 100 megawatt project. That's lack of simple project management. Let me quote something real quick that Diaz-Canel talked about upon his return from China, and this appeared in Cuba Debate. He says, we have to do things well, how we take advantage of opportunities, how we are efficient, how we do not waste resources, and how we achieve adequate returns on investments, and how we're increasingly serious and also more effective in the projects that we propose in order to continue expanding our mutual cooperation, in this case with China. That was Diaz-Canel statements to the Cuban people on Cuba Debate on the 25th of November. We have to learn how to manage projects. We have to be better entrepreneurs. We have to be better executives. We have to have better projects. That was very clear. So I agree with Ricardo that project management and execution, forget about the money. Project management and execution is key. Lack of investments. I mean, they even have lack of investments in capital and scheduled maintenance of the ongoing equipment. That is another problem. You build the equipment, but then you have to have a budget in order to maintain, again, not only scheduled maintenance, but also capital maintenance of that equipment. You have to maintain it operable. That's another thing that Cuba lacks. That planning, long-term planning, to keep the business going. Diaz-Canel made a recent visit to Algeria, Turkey, China, and Russia. And we all wanted to know what was the result of that visit vis-a-vis the electric power sector. Zilch, nothing. They got from Algeria the renewable of about 7,000 barrels a day of crude. That is really not going to help one way or another the electric power sector. They do have a small solar project that Algeria is going to put on the table. The visit to Turkey was a way of trying to find out if the Turkish government could be the guarantor of the debt that is going to be incurred by the 6 power ships that are now in Cuba. Russia, I didn't see anything from Russia, even though some crude oil has arrived in Cuba in the last 6 months, but we haven't seen any recently. And again, China, yes, they got a gift of $100 million, but again, no short-term or immediate plan on how to fix the broken down electric power sector. At the end, Ricardo is right. Who's going to pay for it? There are only 2 pockets. The pocket of the Cuban consumer, he or she doesn't have any money, not even enough money to buy food today. So how they can have money to buy electricity when we know that it's going to be expensive? And the second one is the government. The government is also bankrupt, and it cannot provide any type of subsidy to the electric power system. Is tourism going to keep Cuba afloat for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Is that's going to be it? The economic model of the Cuban economy has to change. They have to find a way of it becoming a market economy model in order to generate the revenues for the state and the revenues for the consumers so they can afford expensive electricity that is going to be reliable, secure, and clean. Otherwise, we will continue in this scenario. By the way, we have seen this movie before. We saw the movie in 2004, 2005, when Marcos Portal was fired. We've seen the same movies, just different actors. And still no solution to the problem. It's very disappointing to some of us because at the end of the day, energy is the engine of economic growth. Energy is the engine of education. Energy is the engine of health. Energy is the engine of investment. Energy is key, and regrettably, Cuba doesn't have it. And I don't think that Cuba will have it in the next 5 or 8 years.
Ricardo.
Yeah, well, I may, I mean, we've talked already a lot, so perhaps, I mean, you, the host, decide where to go the public, but anyway, so let me just pick up 2 things that were already discussed or mentioned by the 2 of us. One is, I recall that, you know, in the last decade, I think it was around 2012 and 2014, there were discussions in Cuba about a possible investment by Odebrecht in one of the sugar cane or the sugar mills in Cuba. And then, but I want to use that example just to illustrate the challenges that Cuba's agricultural sector faces. And in this case, it's very relevant because, as we've discussed, sugarcane, one would imagine, is key for energy, for any important transformation in Cuba's energy mix in the future. I mean, many experts have highlighted the fact that the sector, one of the biggest contributions of that sector today is not necessarily sugar itself, but energy, ethanol, electricity, sustainable energy, domestic source, and so on. So I recall from those discussions that the foreign investor, the biggest concern they had was that apparently the proposal from the Cuban side didn't include them taking over the agricultural parts of the sugarcane production. So it was just about the sugar mill. And they said, no, because without sugarcane, we cannot run the mill. So if you want us to make an investment in upgrading the sugar mill and expanding production and bringing all of the good Brazilian technology that it's been tested so many times successfully in Brazil, we want control also over the agricultural part of it.
Well, again, Ricardo, and this shows you the Cerro Redondo Havana Energy project that was just built. And here's Shanghai Electric holding now a bill for $186 million. And they're sitting there looking to us, Cuba, and telling us, Cuba, where's my bagasse?
Exactly.
I mean, first of all, who would sign a deal with not having a guarantee that you're going to have the feedstock to supply the project? You know, it's a take or pay deal. Somebody owes Shanghai Electric a lot of money. So here's a case. Here is the overbreak conversation that they were having when Lula was in charge. Look at it today. Finally, somebody took the bait. Somebody built the facility. And now they're sitting there. Where's the sugar? Where's the bagasse?
Exactly. And then, you know, Cuba's agricultural problems are, you know, long well known, right? So we've been here before, and there's been an almost endless discussion in Cuba about agricultural reforms. What we know from historical and empirical evidence is that, you know, collectivized agriculture doesn't really deliver. That is the reality. And the fact that even sometimes when you can say, well, you know, right, but, you know, private farmers and cooperatives, they now produce most of Cuba's food. That is true, but they don't have full rights when it comes to the land, when it comes to their crops, when it comes to negotiating a fair price for their production, and so on, so on, so on, so on. Yeah, so formally they are private or even cooperative, but reality is that those property rights are not enforced in full. So, you know, the government, the Cuban government started a meaningful agricultural reform in 2008. There were big hopes back then. They leased out small parcels to farmers or even new people that moved to the countryside. But, you know, in 2016, the same government decided to reverse part of those changes, blaming the private sector for food price increases. And that was the easy, you know, the low-hanging fruit. Okay, everything that goes wrong, we can blame for, you know, the private sector. And so they did. But again, the reality is that that model is not working, it's not delivering, not only in agriculture, but elsewhere. But as Jorge said, you know, Cuba's sugar production this year was not only the lowest in 10 years, it's the lowest in 150 years. And everyone agrees that Cuba has a huge potential in that industry. The sun is there, the plant grows well in Cuba. The energy density of that plant is the highest that I'm aware of. I mean, Jorge can correct me if I'm wrong. So the energy conversion of a sugarcane plant is the highest of any crop. 8-to-1. It's incredible.
Just look at Brazil, and as you said,
Yes.
it's not only sugar, it is biomass electricity, it's ethanol. The numbers that we have run with the University of Florida folks is that Cuba can produce about 50,000 barrels a day of ethanol, assuming that they can recapitalize all of the former agricultural sugarcane. So Cuba could actually Cuba in the future doesn't need to import gasoline because with the right automobiles, the 100% flex fuel cars like they have in Brazil, Cuba's vehicle fleet could run on 100% ethanol. So yes, no question about sugarcane and the contribution that the industry has. But again, Ricardo, I think what you and I are saying is that the government has to realize that the economic structural model of the country doesn't work. It is broken. And they have to change the rules of the game in order for Cuba to grow to what it needs or where it needs to be in the future. Otherwise, I was just while you were talking, by the way, when you look at the 37% target, by the way, I also find it insulting when Cuba produces numbers like this and tell us, oh, by the way, from 25% target, we're now going to go to 37% target still in 2030 with no justification at all. No justification at all. And we ran the numbers. That 37% is equal to 3,500 megawatts, and the investment is going to be between $5 to $6 billion. So how can the folks at UNE, get together with their officials and say, oh, we want to achieve 37% by 2030? Come on, let's be realistic. That is not doable. It is impossible. The time is not there, and the money is not there.
Thank you, Jorge. I think we'll move now to questions from the audience. And I'd like to remind people, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A function, and it will be passed on to the respective presenters. There was one question that has already been answered by Ricardo. That was about whether or not anything tangible came out of Diaz-Canel's recent visit to Algeria, China, Russia, and Turkey. Ricardo, you've already answered that, so we'll move on to the next question from Jonathan Benjamin Alvarado, who asks, even if there were a hypothetical influx of resources to recapitalize the energy sector, is the tourist industry sufficiently large to support a return on investment, given the shortcomings of construction and engineering capacity in Cuba? And this could be answered by either Ricardo or Jorge.
Ricardo, you take it.
Well, certainly I can do it, but I would also appreciate if you could say a word, because I think you've got also things to say about it. And like I like to I'm glad that Benjamin is here with us, because he's also a well-known expert on energy in Cuba. So I mean, he may even want to comment himself about that, but I respect the rules of the house in that regard. Okay, so your question. The way I see it right now, I think there are two parts to my answer. One is, Cuba's tourism industry also faces big challenges. So we've seen what's happened during and after the pandemic. The Caribbean has made quite a significant comeback in terms of the number of visitors and so on. And then Cuba has lagged behind, clearly, in the Caribbean region, even in the Americas. And that, of course, there are many factors behind that. But even before the pandemic, we started noticing that the growth in international visitors significantly slowed down after 2016, 2017. Yes, part of that was due to the fact that the previous administration reversed some of the positive changes introducing Cuba policy in the United States by the Obama administration. Right, but there were other issues, and we can see that very clearly when we look at how many visitors Cuba is getting from other markets rather than the United States. Europe, Russia, even, Canada, and so on. And if we look at the numbers in 2021, we see clearly that the Dominican Republic and all of the other Caribbean destinations are outperforming Cuba by a big margin. So again, I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about other markets, non-US markets that are also important for all the Caribbean destinations. I mean, Canada, Europe, and Russia has been kind of an emerging market in the last decade or so. Even there, Cuba lags behind. then the question is, why is that? What is happening? And it means that Cuba may have a competitiveness problem when it comes to its tourism industry. And I think, there were again big hopes under, in the last years of the Obama administration, because of course, undeniably, the US is the biggest market for all of those destinations, but the reality today is different. So again, the first part is, I'm not sure that Cuba will see a quick recovery in terms of the number of visitors, international visitors, if we use as a reference 2016 or 2017. It's not happening. I mean, the Cuban government itself set a goal for this year of around, getting of around 2.5 million visitors. At best, we'll get something like 1.6 or 1.7. So, there is a question mark about, again, how quickly Cuba can recover those numbers. And then it's also about looking beyond that, beyond the recovery. I mean, let's suppose that in 2 or 3 years, Cuba is back to those numbers. Then, in my opinion, we'll need a far bigger touristic sector to sustain, returns of investment in the order of what we are talking about to completely recapitalize the electric, the power sector, and also to increase the participation of renewable energy in the electric mix. So that's my opinion. I don't think we could only count on international tourism for that. I mean, barring a sea change, meaning the US lifts the embargo completely and unconditionally tomorrow. Aside from that, I don't see, again, Cuba could only rely on, tourism as a way to pay what's needed for those investments. That's what I think.
Jorge, and then we'll move to Jonathan Benjamin Alvarado, who we've unmuted. Go ahead, Jorge.
My only comment is that Cuba cannot continue to rely on tourism. We have to expand. Cuba has to expand its economy. It's not only tourism. What's interesting is, if you look at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and 1960, the first complaint from los revolucionarios era the bad things that the gambling and the tourists and everybody brought to the country. And now we're going back and putting all of our eggs again on tourism. Cuba has to expand its economic base. It cannot only be tourism. Cuba has other resources. Cuba has other technical capabilities. We have a well-educated workforce and people. Come on, tourism, yes, certainly it's going to be part of that economic driver, but we have to expand it. It cannot only be hotels and gambling or whatever else you want to bring to the country to make more money. Sorry about that, Benjamin.
No, Carmen Diana Deere was very, very clear almost 30 years ago when she talked about we had gone back to the future, and that's why I kind of asked that question hypothetically. I agree with both of you that, there has to be a structural change in order for this type of investment to realize, kind of any benefit to the island, and a real dramatic, if not revolutionary, change in the thinking of the Cuban regime in order to be able to realize it. So, Meg, thank you so much for allowing me to chime in. But I hear you all loud and clear, and you're right on point when it comes to kind of how you've analyzed both the challenge, but actually the horror of what we're dealing with right now. Because, Jorge, you and I have been talking about years how every year that we delay engaging and investing, the cost of recapitalizing continues to go up. And now you're saying we're at roughly over $10 billion of needed investment to have any kind of change. That's daunting, given the circumstances Cuba's in and the potential for the future.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is directed to Ricardo. Do you realistically see the Cuban government shifting their spending habits or their priorities away from hotel construction into civil infrastructure improvement? Or is the problem that they can get foreign financing for hotels, but not things like energy generation plants? Ricardo, do you want to start and then we'll move to Jorge?
Yeah, like I'll be more concise this way this time. Well, to be fair, there's been some small changes in the last, I think particularly in the last 2 years. I mean, if you recall one of the slides that I shared, there was an uptick in investment resources devoted to the goods producing sectors. I mean, manufacturing and eventually agriculture as well. Certainly not enough. Again, the investment, the lion's share of investment is still devoted to, hotels, high-end hotels, luxury hotels and the like. I agree with Jorge, Cuba needs to diversify, and certainly we need to diversify away from international tourism. But, realistically speaking, if we look at Cuba's neighborhood, tourism is a key part of all of our neighbors' economy. I mean, and one may imagine that that will be the case for Cuba as well. I mean, no reason to think differently. I mean, tourism is also a big part of Spain's economy, a country that sits in Europe. But yes, we need diversification away from over dependence on international tourism, because we've seen, clearly during these times that it's very risky. You essentially depend on habits and behavior of people that are not within your borders, and that entails risks. And in the case of Cuba, most of it is it comes by air. That also subject to big disruptions, for different reasons. So I understand that there was a bet done in terms of, well, we expect a growing number of visitors. Havana, it was clear that Havana did not have the kind of facilities that could accommodate, again, those rising numbers 5 years ago. So I guess that's when this big plan, these big investments were planned for. But reality has changed. Cuba has changed dramatically in many important ways in the last 5 years. So I believe it is time to reassess our priorities. Now, let me tell you something, because sometimes, and this is usually overlooked in the discussion about Cuba, sometimes, you may hear, some people saying, well, yeah, right, but, returns are nice in tourism, and there are not many other alternatives in Cuba right now. I disagree with that 100%. Let me give you a tangible example. Cuba recently, last year, finally, I have to say, legalized the constitution of private companies, private enterprises. Then let's look at, take a look at the sectors, the industries that those new companies are entering in. Lots of that is light manufacturing. It's a sector that has been long underserved in the Cuban market. And the other big part of it is, home and personal and business services, another industry that has been largely underserved in the Cuban market. And the other sector is the one that we've mentioned already here, which is construction. There is a big need to refurbish lots of things, but also to add capacity in all kinds of industries. So those are the three areas where most of those companies are going. If, against all the constraints and obstacles and impediments coming from Cuba's legal framework, if under those circumstances, those private companies find profitable to enter those industries. That is telling us that there are opportunities for Cuba, in Cuba that we are, that the state companies have not been looking at for a long time. Why is it possible or is it profitable for a private company that most often is at a disadvantage when it comes to state companies? Why is it profitable for them and not for those state companies?
So don't walk over here.
There is a clear problem here in terms of the management system and the incentives behind state companies' operation and private companies' operations. So again, it is definitely time to reassess our priorities. We are in the midst of a crisis. Blackouts is a big failure. People don't lack the energy they need to have a functional life. And that is also holding back the productive sector in Cuba. Remember what I said about energy rationing being introduced in the public sector back in 2016. That's a lot of output lost because there is not enough energy to power the economy and society at large. So yes, my answer is, of course, it is long overdue, that reassessment of priorities in the case of Cuba.
I had further question, and I'm getting a note that
Natalia, if you wait to see if Jorge has a comment, then we'll call on you. All right?
I just
Jorge,
got,
do you have any comment? Is he unmuted? You have to, Jorge, you need to unmute.
No, I'm okay. Bring in Natalia. That's good. I'm
Okay.
okay.
All
I was-
right, Natalia.
well, I personally believe that, like Jorge, and I don't know what Ricardo believes, but I think that until the country transitions into a market economy, it's not going to be able to achieve any of these things because they just naturally, they don't operate in this kind of system, this ability to plan and to plan it accurately, et cetera, or to the mechanisms, the mechanisms that the market imposes and that causes rational decision making are not in play. So I guess what I'd like to know is, assuming that happens, what are the scenarios that you see? I'm assuming that this is not a problem, developing long-term energy ability, not sufficiency, or maybe sufficiency is something that can be dealt with once Cuba were to transition, but how would those scenarios play out? I'd be interested to know what you guys think. I hope I understand my question. Hello?
Jorge?
Yeah, Natalia, it's very basic from the point of view, and I said it earlier, the electric power system throughout its value chain is broken. It is that simple. If it is just like if you and I would like to run the Monaco Grand Prix with one of the Almendrones that we see in Cuba, with a 1956 Chevy, we can't.
No, that's right.
The system is broken. The system is old, over 40 years. The system hasn't had any scheduled maintenance, much less capital maintenance. So there is no short-term solution. It burns continuously Cuban crude oil and high sulfur fuel oil that brings more and additional corrosion to the turbines and to the generators.
Okay, Jorge, but my question is, let's assume that there is a transition to a market system, which I think would be necessary. Then what are the scenarios that you can see that would play out to develop long-term an energy sufficiency for Cuba?
Cuba has to find, number one, the support from multinational financial institutions, whether it's the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and other sources, to pay to obtain the cash and the investment needed in order to begin the recapitalization of this energy infrastructure. They not only have to go to renewables, they also have to change and stop burning oil and switch to natural gas, like the rest of the Caribbean and the rest of the world is going. Natural gas today is the bridge fuel that replaces coal and oil, which are the two most polluting type of fuels used in the electric power sector. But the first thing is, once somehow Cuba has to be part of the international community and say, we have changed our ways, we see the light, we need your help. And many of us will go and support that transition.
Okay, let's assume that happens.
Natalia, let's give Ricardo a chance. Ricardo.
But let me just finish my question, because this really goes to both of them. I'd like you both to address how long a period of time that would take, because that was part of my question.
A power plant today, if you look at a 200 megawatt power plant, you're looking at least 12 to 18 months. We're talking here about the latest figures and numbers that Ricardo and I ran. You're talking about 3,500 megawatts. Easily will take at least 5 years, if not more. That's only on the thermoelectric side. You'll have to add another X number of years to bring renewables. Remember, solar is good. We want Cuba to grow with solar. But the next step in solar is having utility scale storage batteries, which is what we have here in Austin. In Austin, when there is no sun, in the middle of the night, we can draw solar energy. Why? Because we have committed and we have invested in utility scale battery systems. So Natalia is not overnight. It will take at least 5 years, if not more.
Ricardo?
Well, I don't really have a straightforward answer to that question. Like, there are so many factors at play here. I don't see any chance without Cuba tapping into foreign savings of different kinds. I mean, multilateral development banks, because part of that financing, in my opinion, will have to be concessional. Otherwise, Cuba would not be able to afford it. As I said, it's a rather poor country. Part of it will have to be private. Part of it, one would imagine in a very ideal situation, will come from the Cuban diaspora. Again, something that we said earlier, I don't believe this is only about the money, the capital needed to make to fund the critical investments. It's also about engineering and project management capacity that Cuba lacks as of now. And I believe that will also have to come, at least a significant part of it, from overseas. Because, imagine how many big scale projects Cuba will have to manage simultaneously in that ideal situation. I mean, provided that you have the money already committed, imagine how many projects you have to run simultaneously over 5-10 years. Astonishing. It's very complex. This is not easy stuff.
Now, Natalia, you can look, and we can look at public-private partnerships, which is a model that's used for infrastructure projects around the world. And that is when you have a multinational company come in and make the investment, but somehow somebody has to guarantee the return on their investment. In other words, just like the biomass plant in the Cerro Redondo, somebody has to pay for that electricity. Ricardo was talking about what? Uruguay, Ricardo, it was what? 24 cents a kilowatt hour. Somebody has to afford. The Cuban customer, the residential customer, the private customer, or the state has to pay the investor. But I think if you look at PPP's models throughout the world, that's one of the ways of accessing the issue that Ricardo talks about, which is engineering know-how, execution know-how. How do you manage a project of this size? The international companies can do that. In fact, they'll even put in the money. But somebody then has to guarantee the rate of return for that investment to make their investment profitable for their shareholders. So it's not only the multinational corporations, Natalia. Look at PPP projects around the world, and that's a model for Cuba.
Meg, you're muted. We couldn't hear you.
Okay, sorry. There are three more questions, so let's get them out. Cuba has had some success with solar energy production. How has it achieved that success? Who is funding the solar farms? Do you expect the share of solar to continue to grow substantially?
Most of
Either
the
one.
projects in areas like Pinar del Rio have been credit terms from China. So China has been a big contributor. By the way, not only in money, but also in photovoltaic panels and so on. As you know, China is one of the biggest manufacturers of photovoltaic solar panels. But again, when you look at the rest, yeah, it's 200. I think we talked about 200 megawatts.
Yeah, 250 something.
Right.
Close
So it's I don't want to say that it's nickels and dimes, but again, to answer that question, most of the investment that I know of, Ricardo, help me out, is from the Chinese.
Well, there's been
Ricardo?
several contributors here. So there was at least one farm, that was it's actually a private company. It's a British company that invested in a photovoltaic farming in the Mariel Special Development Zone. And I guess the private company went there because the customers there can pay. So in a way, it was guaranteed, right? So it was a guaranteed investment. So that's an easy, low-hanging fruit, so to speak. But there are not many special development zones in Cuba with foreign companies around to pay for that kind of investment. Then I also know that at least three other parties have provided funds for those investments. Some of them are grants, and some of them are like low interest loans, and those are the European Union that have been working, has been working with Cuba in terms of expanding of renewables penetration. The other one is the International Renewable Energy Agency. I think it's based in I don't know, Dubai or Abu Dhabi. I'm not sure. So they've engaged the Cuban government and helping them out in terms of also the planning part of deploying those ambitious goals in terms of energy, so renewable energy, and India, I believe. But the question is, you get some grants and part of that. So far, we've managed to install what? As I said, I think it's 230, 240 megawatts. Cuba, according to the Cuban government, they want 2,000 megawatts in solar capacity by 2030. I mean, that's 10 times what we've done in 8 years. So the time horizon is not really, doesn't really match reality in this case. I believe.
That's what I said, that for those of us that come from the private sector, we find these figures insulting. I mean, if this is a number and a scenario that I will bring before the executive committee of any of the 3 major oil companies that I have worked for, I would be thrown out of the room. So regrettably, I'm sorry, there's no way that Cuba could achieve 37%, 37% of its energy matrix from renewables in the next 8 years. It's just not doable.
Thank you, Jorge. We have a question from Phil Brenner of American University, who thanks you both for detailed, clear, and cogent analyses. My question is their opposition to biomass in Cuba from environmentalists who argue that ethanol is more destructive than fossil fuels. Is this environmental concern a factor in Cuba's energy planning?
No, that I know of. I mean, I haven't heard studies that show that ethanol, I'm sure in this case from corn or from sugar, is more destructible than fossil fuels like coal. No, I haven't heard that's an argument in Cuba, and I certainly have not heard that from the EPA. In other words, it's the opposite. In 2010, the EPA said that sugarcane ethanol was an advanced biofuel. So no, I haven't heard that argument.
Ricardo?
I agree with Jorge, not really in the Cuban context. I understand that, around the time when Cuba started to downsize its sugarcane industry in 2002, and then also in the onset of the energy revolution, there were some prominent figures in the Cuban government that, were concerned about that even ethical contradiction in terms of, growing plants, crops to produce energy. And a big part of that was that, that energy would be exported to the rich countries to fuel their unsustainable lifestyles. Well, the issue here is to start with that we are not talking about exporting that fuel. We are talking about Cuba using it to fuel its economy and society, something that is currently unable to do. The second point is that I think is very relevant. What is a counterfactual in Cuba? It's not that that land is being used to grow something else. Otherwise, Cuba's agricultural production would have exploded in the last 20 years. So the truth is that we liberated those areas where sugarcane was grown back then, and what we have there at best is marabou, which actually enriches the soil because it fixes nitrogen. But aside from that, there isn't any more food being grown in Cuba. So at least when it comes to Cuba, that counterfactual is not relevant. I would agree if we were using that land again to grow something else. That's not Cuba. So we got the worst of both worlds. No sugarcane, no energy, but also not food. So I think it's worst scenario, the worst possible scenario. But so I think at this point, there isn't really opposition in Cuba. At least that I'm aware of. Strong opposition to that. And by the way, the sugarcane industry is much more than sugar, which is, by the way, is needed, ethanol or electricity, but also there are so many derivatives that can be produced out of that plant. It's almost like a miracle plant for the energy conversion that it has. Brazil itself is a big example in that regard.
But Ricardo, I encourage you to read Fidel Castro's speech of March 15, 2005, in which he said that sugar was a slave, that Cuba was not going to go again back to having to be a sugar colony. And that speech, by the way, was in March 15, 2005. I have a copy of it because it reminds me to what could actually be one of the oppositions to sugarcane in Cuba, a dogma set by Fidel Castro back in 2015 that Cuba was not going to be back again, a sugar producer. So
I
think the terms of the discussion have changed. ever since. I'm pretty sure about that. But also, again, the point in Cuba is that we've wasted that land, unused land. And so now we have neither energy nor food. So doesn't look like a good outcome for me anyway.
We have one final question. Professor Kenneth Erickson from the City University of New York asks, if the military have investments and an economic stake in the hotels, is military influence important in preventing the policymakers from looking to serious investments in other productive sectors? Is there a policy conflict between party economists and planners and the military? Ricardo?
Well, I believe, like it is well known, and that's been part of the debate in Cuba in the last few years as well. Because reality is that in some ways there are like two poles in the economy, right? So those companies are managed under different rules, and then you have the more, let's say, more civilian economy where the standard rules apply. So the rules are not necessarily the same for each party. And yes, I can understand that there are different priorities. Now, the thing is, it's only one country. So, I mean, central planning failed to deliver some of its promises. An even worse scenario would be having two poles. A so-called centrally planned economy with two poles. It doesn't work well. Again, going back to my earlier point, yeah, that's definitely a possibility. I'm just saying that the evidence is out there in terms of it is time for Cuba and its government to reassess its priorities when it comes to which sectors will attract the most resources in the immediate future. And again, it's not true either that there are not profitable opportunities in the Cuban market, because if there are profitable opportunities for private companies at a disadvantage, there must be opportunity for the state sector as well. It shows that there are different ways of structuring operations and incentives and so on, but not the fact that structurally there are not opportunities. So yes, but again, that's the answer is yes. That should be part of the explanation, but it's a wrong way of looking at the situation from a country's point of view, from a national point of view.
Jorge, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, my final comment is that I guess the 6 floating power plants that have arrived from Turkey for a total of about 400 megawatts has helped at least the apagones in what it is Metropolitan Havana and its outskirts. Remember, there's 3 of them in Mariel and 3 of them in La Habana. But even yesterday, after 12 days operating, the Quiteras plant in Matanzas went down and it came back up again. So I think we're going to continue to see this scenario. Yes, the power ships have somehow maybe increased the reliability of supply. I was very surprised, as Ricardo pointed out, that in the last week, we have also seen a reduction in demand, which was around 3,100 megawatts to around 2,900 megawatts. So there was not only an increase in some of the supply, but also a decrease in demand. The increase in demand I really question. Don't know how that came about. But Margaret, I think at the end of the day, Cuba faces a real dark future as far as its electric power sector. I just don't see a quick solution. It's going to be long, it's going to be costly, it's going to be painful for the Cuban people, but I don't think there's a quick fix in this issue.
I'd like to remind our audience that this webinar has been recorded and it will be put up within the next 2 weeks on the Cuba program website as well as on YouTube. So you can find it if you want to watch it again, or if you have colleagues that you think might find it of interest. On behalf of the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, as well as the Cuba program of the Institute of Latin American Studies, also at Columbia, I want to thank our speakers today, Jorge Piñon of the University of Texas at Austin, and Ricardo Torres of American University in Washington, D.C., for their very incisive comments and presentations. You have generated, obviously, a very interesting discussion, not only amongst yourselves, but also with the audience. And that's high praise. We look forward to continuing the discussion in other formats with you. So again, thank you both. You've
Thank
done
you.
a terrific job, and also want to thank Leigh Edmonds, our indefatigable assistant, as well as the audience for their attendance today, as well as their questions. So good night and enjoy your holidays. We will meet again in February of next year, and you will be receiving the program sometime in January. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you. Mike, bye.